Hi. The fifth section of Studies in Pessimism is titled Psychological Observations. This is another section of T. Bailey Saunders' own creation. He mentions in his introductory note that the contents of this section, along with the contents of a similar section in a previous translation by Saunders, a previous work translated by Saunders, practically exhausts the content of the section by this title in Schopenhauer's German work. So we're dealing here with another text where the English does not track exactly the order and the arrangement of material given to it by Schopenhauer himself. So I wanted to make sure you knew that from the beginning. This section is over 20 pages long in this version that I'll be reading from, and it contains, by my count, about 40 observations. Some of these are long and some of these are quite short, so I've decided in this video to share with you the first 8 of these, and I'll offer some brief commentary on each one. Here's the first. There is an unconscious propriety in the way in which, in all European languages, the word person is commonly used to denote a human being. The real meaning of persona is a mask, such as actors were accustomed to wear on the ancient stage. And it is quite true that no one shows himself as he is, but wears his mask and plays his part. Indeed, the whole of our social arrangements may be likened to a perpetual comedy. And this is why a man who is worth anything finds society so insipid, while a blockhead is quite at home in it. This is an observation that tracks very closely something Schopenhauer said in Counsels and Maxims, which has been the subject of what is to date my most popular video with the title Why Society Hates Intelligence. I'll link to it up above right now and also in the description below. Schopenhauer noting that to be a human being is to be a person. To be a person has this sort of etymology of to wear a mask, and this is the nature of society, and this accounts for why it is that the rare person of intellectual power and who values truth and truth-telling will be frustrated and find it to be just a sort of public comedy, right? There's a reason why a person of quality finds himself at a loose end in society, whereas the person of lower, say, fewer gifts, finds himself quite at home. Right? There's no difficulty with this because it's all just a matter of play acting, all sorts of things. So, second observation. Reason deserves to be called a prophet, for in showing us the consequence and effect of our actions in the present, does it not tell us what the future will be? This is precisely why reason is such an excellent power of restraint in moments when we are possessed by some base passion, some fit of anger, some covetous desire that will lead us to do things whereof we must presently repent. And so, what have we here? Another an observation. Reason has this kind of prophetic office in our life, doesn't it? Because it shows us how what we're suffering now is the result of the mistakes we made in the past, let us say. But at the same time, isn't that also a foretelling of the future? My reason is saying to me, look, if you do the same thing now or in the near future, this is what will happen again. And so it's up to me to listen to this prophetic voice. Ah, yes, the future is going to be like that because I have seen, using reason, the cause and effect links between my behavior and my suffering. It also suggests, if we flip this around, that there are certain people who will not listen to reason, and they are like people who are ignoring the advice of the prophet, the seer, who can tell the future. And those are the people who will give in to their passions, their anger, their desires at moments when they ought not to, and therefore will acquire this need to rebuke themselves in the future. So an interesting connection of reason with this sort of prophetic office, right? Don't do that. You'll regret it because the cause and effect links that reason uniquely is able to see. Schopenhauer's third observation in this section is one that I made a video about many years ago, just dealing with the quote. This one is about hatred and contempt. Here it is. Hatred comes from the heart, contempt from the head, and neither feeling is quite within our control. For we cannot alter our heart, its basis is determined by motives, and our head deals with objective facts, and applies to them rules which are immutable. Any given individual is the union of a particular heart with a particular head. And by the way, I think that's a nice way of classifying psychologically different people. The heart has a certain character, certain motives. The head has a certain character, a certain ability to grasp the objective facts and apply the immutable rules to them. And in whatever that combination is, you have the majority of the personality of the person. Going back to Schopenhauer now. Hatred and contempt are diametrically opposed and mutually exclusive. There are even not a few cases where hatred of a person is rooted in nothing but forced esteem for his qualities. I like to pause again, even though it's in the middle of a paragraph, and note that's a remarkable observation about human psychology. Some hatred is provoked by nothing more than the mandate, sort of the rational mandate that I admire somebody's character. It's because I admire his qualities and his character so much that I hate him as much as I do. I think that's a rather valuable insight to grasp, that hatred is entirely compatible with a certain type of admiration. In fact, the hatred comes from the admiration. Back to Schopenhauer now. And besides, if a man sets out to hate all the miserable creatures he meets, he will not have much energy left for anything else, whereas he can despise them, one and all, with the greatest ease. True, genuine contempt is just the reverse of true, genuine pride. It keeps quite quiet and gives no sign of its existence. For if a man shows that he despises you, he signifies at least this much regard for you, that he wants to let you know how little he appreciates you, and his wish is dictated by hatred, which cannot exist with real contempt. On the contrary, if it is genuine, it is simply the conviction that the object of it is a man of no value at all. Contempt is not incompatible with indulgent and kindly treatment, and for the sake of one's own peace and safety, this should not be omitted. It will prevent irritation, and there is no one who cannot do harm if he is roused to it. But if this pure, cold, sincere contempt ever shows itself, it will be met with the most truculent hatred, for the despised person is not in a position to fight contempt with its own weapons. That's the end of this observation about hatred and contempt. They are diametrically opposed and mutually exclusive. You cannot feel contempt and hatred for the same object. And what is the difference between them? True, genuine contempt has a kind of loftiness to it, right? It looks down and it is secretive. It feels no need to reveal itself. In fact, he even says, if somebody tries to make you understand that he has contempt for you, he doesn't have contempt for you because he cares enough about your opinion to take sort of pleasure in letting you know that he has a low opinion of you. And I love this expression, pure, cold, sincere contempt. There's something very icy and withdrawn about contempt, which makes it secret and is not incompatible with being indulgent and kindly towards people for whom you have contempt. Why? Not because you feel warmly towards them, but precisely the opposite reason. You feel nothing whatever for them, but you want to move about safely in society, and so you treat them well. We might say out of your own self-interest, not from any sort of an inner motive of warm feeling for them. And then finally, this suggestion, a sort of further motive to keep contempt secret, is that if it ever is shown, it will provoke the most violent hatred. Why? Because the people who are contemned cannot match the same expression back. There's an asymmetry, right? There's a strong gradient of high and low here. And so contempt, if it is known, will be met with violent hatred, which is the only weapon of the low. People who are familiar with Nietzsche and his discussion of the difference between the master moralist and the slave moralist, we'll see an obvious connection here. Let's go on to the fourth observation in this section. Melancholy is a very different thing from bad humor, and of the two, it is not nearly so far removed from a gay and happy temperament. Melancholy attracts, while bad humor repels. Hypochondria is a species of torment. I want to pause here before we go any further. T. Bailey Saunders uses the word hypochondria. I don't think he means it in the medical sense that we appreciate that English word now as having an obsession with imagined or illusory ailments, thinking one is sick when one is not in fact sick. I think he's using it in an older sense. I looked this up in the Oxford English Dictionary, referring to a type of melancholia, which is characterized by the supposed excess generation of black bile. So, um, I do not know from the text here, which I'll read in a moment, whether whether hypochondria is being used as a synonym for melancholy or as a synonym for bad humor. I've checked the German text, which I have up here, but I was not able to find this section because Saunders has shuffled around and renumbered reordered the observations here. So, uh, tell me what you think. Hypochondria is a species of torment which not only makes us unreasonably cross with the things of the present, not only fills us with groundless anxiety on the score of future misfortunes entirely of our own manufacture, but also leads to unmerited self-reproach for what we have done in the past. Hypochondria shows itself in a perpetual hunting after things that vex and annoy, and then brooding over them. The cause of it is an inward morbid discontent, often coexisting with a naturally restless temperament. In their extreme form, this discontent and this unrest lead to suicide. Having read this, I'm inclined to think that hypochondria here is a synonym for bad humor, the quality which repels, whereas melancholy, a genuine melancholy, seems to have, maybe like contempt, something secretive and interior about it. It might actually attract people. But I need to consult the German text more thoroughly before I could render an opinion about that. Next observation. Any incident, however trivial, that rouses disagreeable emotion leaves an after effect in our mind, for and which, for the time it lasts, prevents our taking a clear objective view of the things about us, and tinges all our thoughts, just as a small object held close to the eye limits and distorts our field of vision. I think this is a nice observation about the way in which emotion aroused by something that unpleasant that has happened, even something trivial, will distort our judgment. We cannot see the objective facts of the case while we are still animated by the emotion that's been provoked in us. I think he's just speaking here about the interaction between our mind and our emotional life. That while we are upset, we don't see clearly. That seems to me to be entirely accurate. Like the image of holding something, say like a coin, right in front of your eye. Not only will it block out what is behind it, but it will distort the remainder of your field of vision as well. Next. What makes people hard-hearted is this, that each man has, or fancies he has, as much as he can bear in his own troubles. Hence, if a man suddenly finds himself in an unusually happy position, it will in most cases result in his being sympathetic and kind. But if he has never been in any other than a happy position, or this becomes his permanent state, the effect of it is often just the contrary. It so far removes him from suffering that he is incapable of feeling any more sympathy with it. And so it is that the poor often show themselves more ready to help than the rich. That's a nice observation, I think, for thinking about class conflict and social bubbles. If you take a man who has suffered and you give him great fortune, if he stumbles into great fortune, let's say, or is fortunate, becomes wealthy, he's likely to be a much more sympathetic person towards the poor because of the contrast in his mind between his former state and his current prosperity. If you were to have a person who has always been wealthy, always been prosperous and comfortable, it's likely that person's likely to suffer from a defect of sympathy, precisely because hard-heartedness comes from feeling that you have as much as you can bear in your own troubles. Now, if you've always been comfortable and prosperous, then your own troubles are the troubles of somebody who's never known sort of real suffering, hunger, trouble, coldness, the coldness of the world. And so the poor will often be more ready to help than the rich. This is a theme of many Frank Capra movies and other classic cinema, in my experience. Next observation. At times it seems as though we both wanted and did not want the same thing, and felt at once glad and sorry about it. For instance, if on some fixed date we are going to be put to a decisive test about anything in which it would be a great advantage to us to come off victorious, we shall be anxious for it to take place at once, and at the same time we shall tremble at the thought of its approach. And if in the meantime we hear that, for once in a way, the date has been postponed, we shall experience a feeling both of pleasure and of annoyance. For the news is disappointing, but nevertheless it affords us a momentary relief. It is just the same thing if we are expecting some important letter carrying a definite decision, and it fails to arrive. In such cases, there are really two different motives at work in us. The stronger but more distant of the two being the desire to stand the test and to have the decision given in our favor, and the weaker, which touches on us more nearly, the wish to be left for the present in peace and quiet, and accordingly in further enjoyment of the advantage which at any rate attaches to a state of hopeful uncertainty, compared with the possibility that the issue may be unfavorable. I think this is a nice, keen observation, again, about the feeling of pleasure and pain that we feel in anticipating a test or a decision. We would, he says, what's really at work here is the more remote motive. We want success, we want to pass the test and be successful, but we also have this kind of weaker but closer to us desire to just go on as we are now, even in this kind of hopeful anticipation. We haven't won yet, but we also haven't lost. And that feeling that I have not yet lost is a sort of comfort to me in a way. And so this explains the kind of pleasure and pain, the kind of attraction and repulsion I have to a test that I'm going to be put to, or some task which I hope to perform well at. The eighth and last observation for this video is here. In my head, there is a permanent opposition party, and whenever I take any step or come to any decision, though I may have given the matter mature consideration, it afterwards attacks what I have done, without, however, being each time necessarily in the right. This is, I suppose, only a form of rectification on the part of the spirit of scrutiny, but it often reproaches me when I do not deserve it. The same thing, no doubt, happens to many others as well. For where is the man who cannot help thinking that, after all, it were better not to have done something that he did with great deliberation? And here he quotes two lines of Latin: Quid tam dextro pede concipis ut te conatus non poenat votique peracti. I looked that up. It's a line from one of Juvenal's satires. Google Translate gives it roughly as, "Why do you conceive so rightly that you do not regret your efforts and your vows fulfilled?" It's the end of this eighth aphorism or observation for this video. In my head, there's a permanent opposition party. It's as though, right, the labor controls the majority in my mind, but there's also a strong restive Tory minority which will shout and jeer and criticize and get up at question time to challenge my decisions. How could you have made such a decision that's not in our interests? And I find this is the case even when I've made the right decision. There's this internal opposition party which sort of rises up and says, I have some questions and challenges for you who are in power right now. And this is he links this to what? A rectification on the part of the spirit of scrutiny. I would scrutinize my decisions and, well, what is this? This is the sort of negative moment of my scrutinizing my decisions. This is my rebuking myself for having possibly made the wrong decision. And the idea that this represents a kind of opposition bench, an opposition party within the kind of parliament of my mind is, I think, very suggestive. I rather like the idea here. And it may be that sometimes it's a closely divided parliament. And so the challenges are quite vociferous, and the opposition party is waiting to take over at any moment. Or it might be that this is just simply the way that the opposition sort of harries the government and rallies their troops and sort of keeps up the spirits of the opposition backbenchers so that they don't become restive. Sort of just keeping a hand in so the party's agenda gets at least mentioned, even if it's going to be rejected as a matter of policy. And so it's the same thing, no doubt, happens to everybody else, and I think he's quite right about that. I think we all experience, if we've got sort of an inner reflective life, the fact that there's a kind of permanent opposition party in my mind that's ready to criticize my decisions and that may even sort of cause me, if I'm not firm about it, cause me to doubt myself and to come to a certain kind of sort of psychological difficulty. So those are the first 8 observations of the section Psychological Observations from Studies in Pessimism. We'll take a look at the next 2 sections, I think, in the next video. These are rather long, and they both deal with the difference between the common and the noble. So I think there'll be some Nietzschean themes in those as well. So that's all for this video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Bye. In the Psychological Observations section of Studies in Pessimism, the 9th and 10th observations are about what is common versus what is extraordinary in human experience, in human existence. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. Why is it that common is an expression of contempt, and that uncommon, extraordinary, distinguished denote approbation? Why is everything that is common contemptible? And I was able to find, by the way, this in the German text that Saunders is translating. Not surprisingly to people who know German, the word that Schopenhauer is using for common is gemein, and its opposites, which he just gave, ungemein, außerordentlich, and ausgezeichnet. So that's the German, to check up on that. Continuing now with Saunders' English translation of Schopenhauer. Common, in its original meaning, denotes that which is peculiar to all men, that is, shared equally by the whole species, and therefore an inherent part of its nature. Accordingly, if an individual possesses no qualities beyond those which attach to mankind in general, he is a common man. Ordinary is a much milder word, and I'll note here that the German expression translated by Saunders as ordinary is gewöhnlicher Mensch. Ordinary is a much milder word and refers rather to intellectual character, whereas common has more of a moral application. What value can a creature have that is not a whit different from millions of its kind? Millions, do I say? Nay, an infiniture of creatures, which, century after century, in a never-ending flow, nature sends bubbling up from her inexhaustible springs. As generous with them as the smith with the useless sparks that fly around his anvil. Now, I'll just mention here, this brings to my mind some of Darwin's recognition and, in fact, a kind of moral and intellectual struggle with the realization that nature is very wasteful with the lives that she creates. The vast majority of beings that are born die rather quickly and rather terribly at the hands of predators. This is maybe characteristic of intellectual thought in Schopenhauer and Darwin's time here in the mid-19th century. Going on. It is obviously quite right that a creature which has no qualities except those of the species should have to confine its claim to an existence entirely within the limits of the species, and live a life conditioned by those limits. In various passages of my works, I have argued that whilst a lower animal possesses nothing more than the generic character of its species, man is the only being which can lay claim to possess an individual character. But in most men, this individual character comes to very little in reality, and they may be almost all ranged under certain classes. Ce sont des espèces. Their thoughts and desires, like their faces, and are those of the species, or at any rate, those of the class to which they belong, and accordingly, they are of a trivial, everyday, common character, and exist by the thousand. You can usually tell beforehand what they are likely to do and say. They have no special stamp or mark to distinguish them. They are like manufactured goods, all of a piece. So what's being said here, I think, simply that the majority of people, if they are common, if they have nothing to distinguish themselves from the general species, they live a kind of generic existence, what you'll say in the next paragraph. They are like the sparks from the anvil of the blacksmith. They are like the massive number of eggs or of young that are born in Darwin's nature, only to perish rather speedily. And that this is simply the character of, although human beings are uniquely capable of having an individual existence, not everybody achieves, we might say, individuality. Many people seem to slump back into something more characteristic of what Nietzsche might later call the last man. Going on. If then their nature is merged in that of the species, how shall their existence go beyond it? The curse of vulgarity puts men on a par with the lower animals by allowing them none but a generic nature, a generic form of existence. I think here of nothing quite so much as of the NPC meme, right? The person who simply receives their programming from outside and exists solely as a member of a crowd, as a member of the mob, as someone parroting ideas not that they don't truly understand. Anything that is high or great or noble must then, as a matter of course and by its very nature, stand alone in a world where no better expression can be found to denote what is base and contemptible than that which I have mentioned as in general use, namely, common. That's the 9th observation. The 10th begins thus. Will, as the thing in itself, is the foundation of all being. It is part and parcel of every creature and the permanent element in everything. Will, then, is that which we possess in common with all men, nay, with all animals, and even with lower forms of existence. And insofar as we are akin to everything, so far that is, as everything is filled to overflowing with will. On the other hand, that which places one being over another and sets differences between man and man is intellect and knowledge. Therefore, in every manifestation of self, we should, as far as possible, give play to the intellect alone. For, as we have seen, the will is the common part of us. Every violent exhibition of will is common and vulgar. In other words, it reduces us to the level of the species and makes us a mere type and example of it, in that it is just the character of the species that we are showing. So every fit of anger is something common. Every unrestrained display of joy, or of hate, or fear, in short, every form of emotion. In other words, every movement of the will, if it's so strong as decidedly to outweigh the intellectual element in consciousness, and to make the man appear as a being that wills rather than knows. I think that's a fantastic paragraph. We're now in this observation tying in the previous observations about the common and the uncommon with this metaphysics of the will. And what is it that we are doing and being when we are acting in a common way, in the way that any human being could act, or in harmony with the human nature we share with everyone else? To the extent we're doing that, we're behaving not just generically, existing generically, but we are giving rein to will, which is this thing that unites all beings, human, animal, and even sort of sub-animal being. So when we give play to violent emotion, when I get angry, I lash out. What am I doing? I am not being authentically, let's say, myself, my highest and best self, my uniquely individual self that is different from all people. I am behaving in the way that my lower nature directs me to. It seems to me there's a lot of Spinoza in this connection of this analysis of the emotions as a source of disquiet. He mentions joy as well as hate and fear, right? If you are giving way to these things, these are common. These are sort of, in a sense, kind of dragging you down from your expression of yourself and your individuality. You are behaving as anyone might behave in that regard. And so if we wish to be truly individual, we should strengthen our intellect over our will, and we should endeavor to behave and think and exist always through our intellect primarily, rather than through our will. To the extent that we are will, we are common and lower. Schopenhauer goes on. In giving way to emotion of this violent kind, the greatest genius puts himself on a level with the commonest son of earth. Contrarily, if a man desires to be absolutely uncommon, in other words, great, he should never allow his consciousness to be taken possession of and dominated by the movement of his will, however much he may be solicited thereto. For example, he must be able to observe that other people are badly disposed towards him without feeling any hatred towards them himself. Nay, there is no surer sign of a great mind than that it refuses to notice annoying and insulting expressions, but straightway ascribes them, as it ascribes countless other mistakes, to the defective knowledge of the speaker, and so merely observes without feeling them. This is the meaning of that remark of Gracian, that nothing is more unworthy of a man than to let it be seen that he is one. El mayor desdoro del hombre es dar muestras de que es hombre. The greatest disgrace of a man is to signal that he is a man. Okay. There's something here that the intellect, it seems in Schopenhauer, that is calling us to live higher than the mere level of will which we have common to all. I love this portrait of the superior person. If you wish to be superior, then you should be able to notice that people dislike you, but ascribe it to intellectual error. Or if they don't really know me. That's why they dislike me. If I react to their dislike by disliking them in return, now I've given in to will. Now I've sunk, we might say, maybe to their level, but certainly lower than I should be within myself. There is no surer, no surer sign of a great mind than it doesn't even notice insults and annoying expressions of other people, but ascribes them to defective knowledge. Right? Their intellects are not correctly informed or powerful enough to understand the truth. I, who know the truth, am untouched by them then. That seems to be the attitude that Schopenhauer here is describing. Okay? Don't give in to will, place intellect over will. Going on. And even in the drama, which is the peculiar province of the passions and emotions, it is easy for them to appear common and vulgar. And this is especially observable in the works of the French tragic writers, who set no other aim before themselves than the delineation of the passions. And by indulging at one moment in a vaporous kind of pathos, which makes them ridiculous, at another in epigrammatic witticisms, endeavor to conceal the vulgarity of their subject. I remember seeing the celebrated Mademoiselle Rachel as Maria Stuart, and when she burst out in fury against Elizabeth, though she did it very well, I could not help thinking of a washerwoman. She played the final parting in such a way as to deprive it of all true tragic feeling, of which indeed the French have no notion at all. The same part was incomparably better played by the Italian Ristori, and in fact the Italian nature, though in many respects very different from the German, shares its appreciation for what is deep, serious, and true in art, herein opposed to the French, which everywhere betrays that it possesses none of this feeling whatever. Okay. Interesting analysis of national characters, or sort of invocation of national characters or prejudices. The French dramatic writers concealing the vulgarity of their subject behind the sort of mastery of their craft. But ultimately, it's all about just sort of exploring the emotions, which is itself part of the will element in human existence, and therefore of a kind of a lower character, a lower nature. Schopenhauer. The noble, in other words, the uncommon element in the drama, nay, what is sublime in it, is not reached until the intellect is set to work, as opposed to the will, until it takes a free flight over all those passionate movements of the will and makes them subject to its contemplation. Shakespeare in particular shows that this is his general method, more especially in Hamlet. And only when intellect rises to the point where the vanity of all effort is manifest, and the will proceeds to an act of self-annulment, is the drama tragic in the true sense of the word. And it is then that it reaches its highest aim in becoming really sublime. That's the end of the 10th observation in this section and the end of what I'll discuss in this video. Praise of Shakespeare, I think, to be expected from Schopenhauer, in contrast to the French dramatists of his own day. And where do we find the true sublimity, the sort of maximum reach of literature and of drama, when it invokes the intellect and the intellect sweeps in to sort of pull the emotional, will-based elements of the play up into a kind of intellectual comprehension of the true tragedy of life. And you see this in the greatest dramas of Shakespeare, for example, as he mentions in Hamlet here. There's a place where the feeling gives way to understanding and to knowledge. And we admire Shakespeare not just as somebody who can convey emotion effectively through his art, but as someone who seems to truly understand some core realities about human being, about friendship and betrayal and old age and the vengeance and all of the different elements that come through in his plays. We feel like we're sitting at the foot of someone who is truly wise about human nature and its exceptional capabilities. And that, I think, is part of what Schopenhauer is going for here by talking about the way that the intellect elevates theater to the level of the sublime, of the truly important. So those are the two observations, 9th and 10th, in this section from Studies in Pessimism. We'll take a look at the next couple of observations in another video. Thank you for watching today. Goodbye. Hi. This video is about observations 11 through 17 in the Psychological Observations section of Studies in Pessimism by Arthur Schopenhauer, translated by T. Bailey Saunders. What these observations all have in common, I think, is the difficulty of achieving an objective view of yourself and of other people, the various ways in which human psychology interferes with our ability to see ourselves and others as we really are. The 17th final observation for this video is one of my favorites about mirrors and self-knowledge, so we'll get to that in time. Here's the 11th observation. Every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. This is an error of the intellect as inevitable as that error of the eye, which lets us fancy that on the horizon heaven and earth meet. This explains many things, and among them the fact that everyone measures us with his own standard, generally about as long as a tailor's tape, and we have to put up with it, as also that no one will allow us to be taller than himself, a supposition which is, once for all, taken for granted. Schopenhauer here notes that it is a sort of general rule of human psychology that I judge other people according to the standard that is my own. I judge them as though they were another version of me. These standards are often very humble. There's a reference to the tailor's tape, right? There's something kind of cheap and humble, low class about it. But it's also a non-objective judgment, right? I'm not judging you according to your merits. I'm judging you according to how well you meet up with my standards, which may or may not suit you. that suggests that there is this kind of built-in, inevitable selfishness in all of our judgments of other people, which we're going to need to work to overcome as we sort of rise towards a higher level of understanding and self-consciousness. The 12th observation: there is no doubt that many a man owes his good fortune in life solely to the circumstance that he has a pleasant way of smiling, and so wins the heart in his favor. However, the heart would do better to be careful, and to remember what Hamlet put down in his tablets, that one may smile, and be a villain. We already know of Schopenhauer's admiration for Shakespeare, and here a simple observation, perhaps partly autobiographical, that many people owe their success in life simply not to any intellectual ability or any objective excellence, but to the fact that they smile well, that they have good manners, that they are pleasing to other people, that they are winsome. And this can win people's hearts in their favor, even though, as Shakespeare knew, and as Hamlet says of Claudius, one may smile and yet still be a villain. That the smile is no indication of the moral quality or the excellence of the character behind it. Next observation: everything that is really fundamental in a man, and therefore genuine, works as such unconsciously, in this respect like a power of nature. That which has passed through the domain of consciousness is thereby transformed into an idea or picture. And so, if it comes to be uttered, it is only an idea or picture which passes from one person to another. Accordingly, any quality of mind or character that is genuine and lasting is originally unconscious, and it is only when unconsciously brought into play that it makes a profound impression. If any like quality is consciously exercised, it means that it has been worked up, and it becomes intentional, and therefore a matter of affectation, in other words, of deception. I'll pause in the middle of this observation because I think this is a fantastic psychological insight that in order to be genuine, in order to have a quality, we must have it, as it were, unconsciously without knowing it and thinking about it. We must have it, I would say, sort of at the level of being or habit deep in us. If we attempt to fake it, if we attempt to imitate it, then it becomes an affectation. It becomes, we might say, reaching for another Schopenhauer concept, it becomes the product of will. Right? I am making myself smile, for example, or I am forcing myself, I am putting on the sort of the show of doing or being something that I am not. And this is where we end up with deception. We'll go back to the rest of this observation now. If a man does a thing unconsciously, it costs him no trouble. But if he tries to do it by taking trouble, he fails. This applies to the origin of those fundamental ideas which form the pith and marrow of all genuine work. Only that which is innate is genuine and will hold water. And every man who wants to achieve something, whether in practical life, in literature, or in art, must follow the rules without knowing them. That's the end of this observation. And just to repeat my comments from before, I think this is brilliant in terms of its observation of the relation between the conscious and the unconscious in our activities. If I know that if I'm doing something and I know that I'm doing it, the more attention I pay to doing it, the more it becomes the product of my deliberate choice and not the sort of overflowing of my being, not something that I'm simply doing habitually or as a matter of what I am and how I am. So when a man attempts to do something that he does naturally, he fails at doing it. I'm reminded here of a story I dimly remember about the great golfer Bobby Jones. I think I was once told that Jones was a fantastic golfer until he sat down to try to write a book about how to golf. And the very process of thinking through how do you hold the club, how do you swing, what is it that makes me so excellent at this, completely spoiled his game. I imagine that's somewhat apocryphal, but there are many other stories like this. I'm certain of somebody who is a high performer at a certain field until he begins to overanalyze exactly what he does that makes him good at it. And when it moves from the realm of being unconscious activity to being the sort of object of conscious choice at every moment, the will gets in there and fouls things up. And the great expression here at the end is worth remembering. To be great, one must be able to follow the rules without knowing what the rules are. One simply one simply acts and acts well. Next observation. Men of very great capacity will, as a rule, find the company of very stupid people preferable to that of the common run, for the same reason that the tyrant and the mob, the grandfather and the grandchildren, are natural allies. There's not much to this observation, but I think Schopenhauer here is giving us his own mid-19th century version of the midwit meme, where the very excellent and the very, very stupid have something in common, where it's the strivers and the strugglers and the very earnest people in the middle who stand out against both of them. So an alliance of the extreme ends of the bell curve against the high middle, we might say. 15th observation. This one I need to preface by explaining a bit about what's going on in Ovid. I'm not going to try to translate the Latin directly, but what's being referred to here is a line from Ovid's Metamorphoses, here at the beginning and then again at the end of this observation, which refers to the creation of human beings. And what Ovid tells us is that Prometheus, while he makes the other animals to look straight ahead or to look at the ground, that is to say that their skulls are fused onto their spines, so that by their very biology, their very body type, they are made to look out at the world or around or down at the world. Unlike those other animals, the gods have made human beings to walk upright on two legs with their head atop their spine so that they can look not just around at the world and at each other, but also look up at the stars. And so there's this sort of metaphor of the face of the animal is outward and downward facing, but the face of the human being, having this sort of special dignity and privilege from the gods, is such that it can gaze up at the heavens, at the abode of the gods themselves. So that's the reference that Schopenhauer is playing with here in quoting Ovid in Latin. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. That line of Ovid's, proneque cum spectent animalia cetera terram, can be applied in its true physical sense to the lower animals alone. But in a metaphorical and spiritual sense, it is, alas, true of nearly all men as well. All their plans and projects are merged in the desire of physical enjoyment, physical well-being. They may indeed have personal interests, often embracing a very varied sphere, but still these latter receive their importance entirely from the relation in which they stand to the former. This is not only proved by their manner of life and the things they say, but it even shows itself in the way they look, the expression of their physiognomy, their gait and gesticulations. Everything about them cries out, in terram prona, right, face down on the earth. It is not to them, it is only to the nobler and more highly endowed natures, men who really think and look about them in the world and form exceptional specimens of humanity, that the next lines are applicable. Os homines sublime dedit coelumque tueri usit et erectos ad sidera tolere vultus. That is, the gods have given human beings an upturned aspect, commanding them to look towards the skies and upright raise their faces to the stars. So this, as I said, is Schopenhauer using this line from Ovid about the sort of the biological orientation of animals and humans to draw a separation between what we might call, he's accusing these kind of spiritually animalistic humans who may value a great variety of things, but for whom it's all ultimately tied back into the terrestrial, the things that the animal with its forward-looking face is looking at. They receive their importance entirely from their attachment to physical enjoyment, physical pleasures, and material well-being, and that it is what Ovid is speaking of as the privilege of the human race, Schopenhauer seems to be claiming as merely the privilege of, in the modern period anyway, the higher type of individual nature, the one who's able to turn away from the physical towards the spiritual, the intellectual. So that is observation 15. Number 16. No one knows what capacities for doing and suffering he has in himself until something comes to rouse them to activity. Just as in a pond of still water, lying there like a mirror, there is no sign of the roar and thunder with which it can leap from the precipice, and yet remain what it is. Or again, rise high in the air as a fountain. When water is as cold as ice, you can have no idea of the latent warmth contained in it. That's the end of this short observation, and I think Schopenhauer talking here about the hidden power that we may find in individuals, which may often surprise us. The image of the water which is still, which might spray up in a fountain or thunder over a cliff as a waterfall. The behavior of the water at this moment does not reveal its inner power. And in the same way, the soul at rest, the individual person, has no idea what capacity for suffering, and we might add therefore for greatness, he might have. And people may surprise you. The person of whom you thought very little may turn out to have a tremendous soul. And this line at the end, I think, another great aphorism or epigram from Schopenhauer: when water is as cold as ice, you can have no idea of the latent warmth contained in it. So you can look at the still pond in the pool, and it is icy. It is extremely cold. The cold soul, the cold self, the still self. Well, it may have a tremendous amount of power stored up in it, which will only be revealed in action. The 17th and final observation for this video is one I mentioned at the beginning about the nature of mirrors. And here it is. Why is it that in spite of all the mirrors in the world, no one really knows what he looks like? A man may call to mind the face of his friend, but not his own. Here then is an initial difficulty in the way of applying the maxim, know thyself. This is partly, no doubt, to be explained by the fact that it is physically impossible for a man to see himself in the glass except with face turned straight towards it and perfectly motionless, where the expression of the eye, which counts for so much and really gives its whole character to the face, is to a great extent lost. But coexisting with this physical impossibility, there seems to me to be an ethical impossibility of an analogous nature, and producing the same effect. A man cannot look upon his own reflection as though the person presented there were a stranger to him, and yet this is necessary if he is to take an objective view. In the last resort, an objective view means a deep-rooted feeling on the part of the individual, as a moral being, that which he is contemplating is not himself. And unless he can take this point of view, he will not see things in a really true light, which is possible only if he is alive to their actual defects, exactly as they are. I'm going to pause for a comment in the middle of this observation because I think Schopenhauer has given us something really to think about here. There are all the mirrors in the world, and yet I never truly see myself. The first note that I can imagine my friend's face in my mind, but I have difficulty imagining my own. Now, why is this? First, there's the physical metaphor. I only see myself in the mirror from the perspective head-on, looking straight at it. I don't see myself from the side, in motion, prior to cameras, certainly. And it seems that I can't encounter myself the way others encounter me. Okay? So that's the physical option. But the moral impossibility that parallels this is that I always know it's me. when I'm looking at myself, that I can't look upon myself as a stranger. Okay? And yet it is precisely as a stranger that I need to look upon myself to see myself as I truly am. So there's something going on here. My sense of self, my attachment to my own subjectivity is getting in the way of my self-perception. And I think the use of mirrors here to say the mirror doesn't really show you you. It shows you you as you, not you as others see you and can see you. In a sense, the one thing I cannot do with a mirror or unless I can overcome this moral difficulty in any way is to actually see myself and know myself as I truly am, as I truly appear to other people. And so I'm never able to achieve this objectivity, which consists in knowing that what I'm looking at is something other than me. So and so I can't see myself with my own faults. We may even relate this back to the initial observation from this video that everyone measures by his own standard. Well, my own standard is there always, even when I'm looking at myself. And so how am I to know what I truly am? How am I to acquire real and valuable self-knowledge? Schopenhauer goes on. Instead of that, when a man sees himself in the glass, something out of his own egoistic nature whispers to him to take care to remember that it is no stranger but himself that he is looking at. And this operates as a noli me tangere and prevents him taking an objective view. It seems indeed as if, without the leaven of a grain of malice, such a view were impossible. That's the end of observation 17. And closing off this thought, what do I see when I see myself? I see myself as I see anybody else, any other image, and yet there is something in my ego whispering in my ear. That's you, right? That's you, pal, right? That is a person for whom you may need to take special care and special recognition, right? Don't judge him too harshly. Don't evaluate him the way you evaluate others. There's always this knowledge that that's me when I am evaluating myself. And we don't have to think of this merely as a physical or an optical observation of the self. Whenever I think about myself, my behavior, my triumphs, my crimes, I'm thinking of them as being mine, right? They're mine. Something is magnified about them in my own consciousness. They are especially great or especially terrible because they're mine. And this reference, this Latin reference, this whispering in my ear, that's you, acts as a noli me tangere. This means do not touch me. These are the words of the resurrected Christ to Mary Magdalene at the tomb, indicating it's not appropriate or worthy that you should touch me. This is what my image says to me, right? When I look at my image, there's something in it that says, don't be too harsh on this one. Don't judge this one the way you would judge others for their excellence or their quality. And his final turn here, sounding maybe a note of hope, but also a note of menace, that what we really need is a tiny grain of malice. And I think it's self-malice. It's malice towards myself. I have to look in the mirror and say, I'm going to get at the truth about that guy. I'm going to understand the objective quality of that guy's defects. And to do so, I'm going to have to treat him like he's an alien to me, like he's a stranger, like he's not me. I'm going to have to somehow find a way to overcome the ego's prejudice in favor of itself that Schopenhauer's been dwelling on in this observation about mirrors. So that is this is my video about observations 11 through 17 in Psychological Observations from Studies in Pessimism. We will take a look at the next observations in another video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Hi. This video covers observations 18 through 23 in the Psychological Observations section of Schopenhauer's Studies in Pessimism. The first and longest of these observes and attempts to explain the fact that we individually in our psychology veer between caring little or nothing about the affairs of this world and being heavily invested in them and caring about them a great deal. I might call this the nothing ever happens versus we are so back dichotomy. Schopenhauer has an explanation for this in terms of his philosophy of the human person. Other observations deal with the psychology of the great, why it is that people of exceptional ability seem to obey a different set of rules from the common run of people, the value of having a friend to give you an outside perspective to achieve an objective estimation of your own character and person, and then a few very short observations about the psychology of death and how we tend to react to knowledge of our coming end. Here's the 18th observation. According as a man's mental energy is exerted or relaxed, will life appear to him either so short and petty and fleeting that nothing can possibly happen over which it is worth his while to spend emotion, that nothing really matters, whether it is pleasure or riches or even fame, and that in whatever way a man may have failed, he cannot have lost much. Or, on the other hand, life will seem so long, so important, so all in all, so momentous and so full of difficulty that we have to plunge into it with our whole soul if we are to obtain a share of its goods, make sure of its prizes, and carry out our plans. This latter is the immanent and common view of life. It is what Gracian means when he speaks of the serious way of looking at things. Tomar muy de veras el vivir, to take life very seriously. The former is the transcendental view, which is well expressed in Ovid's Non est tanti. It is not worth so much trouble. Still better, however, by Plato's remark that nothing in human affairs is worth any great anxiety. And here Schopenhauer quotes some Greek that he attributes to Plato. I've put it up on the screen. I did a small bit of research, by which I mean I checked Reddit, and it seems, according to Redditors who've checked, that Schopenhauer has hallucinated this quote from Plato. These words in Greek do not seem to appear in a digital search of Plato's corpus. So my suspicion is that Schopenhauer, vaguely recollecting some idea from Plato, more or less accurately, constructed this quote in Greek on his own and ascribed it to Plato. Okay. I don't mean that as a direct accusation, and I'm happy to be corrected about it by anybody who cares to do the research. But it seems that this is a bit of a hand wave on Schopenhauer's part. As to the main part of this observation, which is not quite finished yet, here's Schopenhauer's observation about human beings and our psychology. We go back and forth between thinking nothing really matters. We are not able to really lose very much because none of the goods in this life are worth much at all, versus on the other hand, things are so important and so vital that I need to commit myself completely and utterly to grasping the good that is available in life. Knowing Schopenhauer as we do, we know which side he's going to come down on as being the objective and correct view of human life. But let's take a look now at his explanation for why this is the way it is with us. Schopenhauer goes on. This condition of mind is due to the intellect having got the upper hand in the domain of consciousness, where, freed from the mere service of the will, it looks upon the phenomena of life objectively, and so cannot fail to gain a clear insight into its vain and futile character. But in the other condition of mind, will predominates, and the intellect exists only to light it on its way to the attainment of its desires. A man is great or small according as he leans to the one or the other of these views of life. So here we have Schopenhauer's explanation, don't we? Why is it that sometimes we have this view, sometimes the other? It is because we go back and forth between our intellect being superior to our will and our will being superior to our intellect. So to be a human being, to be a human consciousness or subjectivity, means to experience this constant struggle within you of will and intellect. And this reminds me, of course, and I think it ought to remind all of us, of Plato's account of the soul, with reason struggling to keep appetite in check. But here it is will. It's this sort of life force welling up within me that strives and struggles and consequently is miserable and makes me miserable because it can never be satisfied. For Schopenhauer, when I have these moments of realizing that nothing matters, that is when I have a clear-eyed intellectual view of the objective reality of my existence. Nothing really does matter. That's when I'm right. My intellect has been freed from serving my will, and I can, for a few moments, enjoy peace. Will is quieted then by this intellectual recognition. This is philosophical wisdom and its fruit, according to Schopenhauer. On the other hand, when I feel that life is full of good and I need to immerse myself in it and throw myself into it wholeheartedly, now that is will that is dominating over intellect. I see myself inaccurately, and I ignore, I forget the vanity and futility of striving, and I reduce my intellect, he says here too, only lighting the way of the will on the attainment of it to the attainment of its desires. I think here either Schopenhauer in the original German, or if not him, then certainly T. Bailey Saunders in his English translation, is deliberately echoing the expression of Hobbes in describing the role of the intellect in human life. Hobbes uses almost this exact same expression, that the role of reason is merely to show the way of the will to the thing desired. Schopenhauer is explicitly here rejecting that view, that Hobbesian view of the will, or I should say he's associating it with misery and an inaccurate, objectively inaccurate or false self-perception. But what is greatness or smallness in human personality? It is the inclination to one or the other, the intellectual or the willful experience of oneself. So, a great observation there, I think, with a lot of Schopenhauer's philosophy in it. We'll go on to the next one now. People of very brilliant ability think little of admitting their errors and weaknesses, or of letting others see them. They look upon them as something for which they have duly paid, and instead of fancying that these weaknesses are a disgrace to them, they consider that they are doing them an honor. This is especially the case when the errors are of the kind that hang together with their quality, conditiones sine quibus non, or, as George Sand said, les défauts de ses vertus. Contrarily, there are people of good character and irreproachable intellectual capacity who, far from admitting the few little weaknesses they have, conceal them with care and show themselves very sensitive to any suggestion of their existence. And this just because their whole merit consists in being free from error and infirmity. If these people are found to have done anything wrong, their reputation immediately suffers. I think this is an interesting observation because it puts us onto an explanation for the different set of rules that seem to apply to the great. Why is it that this politician or this celebrity is so shameless in doing, in fact, admitting to doing things that would cause any of us to cringe and to seek refuge? Why do the shameful things that we keep secret become a source of indifference or even pride for them? And Schopenhauer's explanation here is that for people of very high ability, people of superior excellence, their faults are simply part of themselves. They become almost adornments of their greatness, things for which they have paid, things which do them honor. They take pride in their faults. We might say this is the privilege of excellence, is the ability to, unlike the common run of people like you and me, to take pride in your faults, to show them without shame. And I think that, of course, is the case he says here as well, especially that it's the case if these faults are of a piece with, are necessary conditions for the element that causes your greatness. So if I'm admiring a particular great person, I would say, well, his greatness goes along with his vices. The vices are just part of the whole package. And my respect for his excellence leads me to minimize or merely accept his vices. Whereas this other kind of person, right, people of good character and intellectual capacity, but they're deeply ashamed of their errors and faults because their merit comes not from this sort of excellence that they have, but for being thought to be flawless. So here's the interesting irony of, I think, is that it is the shame and the desire to be perfect, to appear to be perfect, is precisely the preoccupation of the middle run of people, the high group in the bell curve, the strivers. The truly excellent don't care about any of that at all. They're more than willing to admit that they're flawed. So here's this sort of ironical inversion that the more superior you are, the less need you have to be or to appear perfect, to the point where you can even sort of take a kind of shameless pride in your vices. They don't become vices. We might say the very idea of shameful vice is a kind of a bourgeois phenomenon. It's a middle class thing to need to be ashamed of your errors and crimes. That as a person ascends to this higher and higher level of excellence, the very quality of their excellence excuses all of their faults. And again, most especially when those faults are actually connected with the source or the activity that is their greatness. Next observation. With people of only moderate ability, modesty is mere honesty. But with those who possess great talent, it is hypocrisy. Hence, it is just as becoming in the latter to make no secret of the respect they bear themselves, and no disguise of the fact that they are conscious of unusual power, as it is in the former to be modest. Valerius Maximus gives some very neat examples of this in his chapter on self-confidence, De Fiducia Sui. This is the second observation about the psychology of the great, and it is the kind of flip version of the former. Just as the great need feel no shame for their errors, they need feel no modesty about their greatness and about boasting about it, about sharing with it, and sharing with you the very high opinion they have of themselves. It is just fine for Caesar to glorify Caesar just as other people glorify Caesar, to take a non-contemporary example for us. So to make no secret of one's self-respect and one's excellence is, in fact, the privilege, and Schopenhauer might say rightly so, of the people of excellent ability. Next. Not to go to the theater is like making one's toilette without a mirror. But it is still worse to take a decision without consulting a friend. For a man may have the most excellent judgment in all other matters, and yet go wrong in those which concern himself. Because here the will comes in and deranges the intellect at once. Therefore, let a man take counsel of a friend. A doctor can cure everyone but himself. If he falls ill, he sends for a colleague. An observation here about the value of friendship. Our friends can see things in us that we don't see, in part because, great expression here, the will comes in whenever I'm trying to judge myself and deranges my intellect. It simply scrambles it so I can't see myself as I truly am. I need my friends just as a doctor needs a fellow physician to heal him when he's ill. The last two observations I'll take together since they both deal with death. In all that we do, we wish, more or less, to come to the end. We are impatient to finish and glad to be done. But in the last scene of all, the general end, is something that, as a rule, we wish as far off as may be. Every parting gives a foretaste of death, every coming together again a foretaste of the resurrection. This is why even people who were indifferent to each other rejoice so much if they come together again after 20 or 30 years' separation. The first of these deals with the fact that we often would like to come to the end, especially of an unpleasant process, but it's not the case that we are rushing towards our death. No one wants to die so as to be free from the burdens of life. We would like to be done with it, but we're not going to hasten it. We're not going to seek out its end. As a general rule, we'd like to have it as far off as may be. Okay? And this, the flip side of this, it's curious to see a thinker like Schopenhauer speaking of the resurrection as a kind of cultural touchstone. Every parting gives a foretaste of death. I'm torn away from my friend by our departure. but every meeting again, a foretaste of resurrection, a sort of source of hope. And so if I meet someone I knew in high school 3 decades ago, I am far happier than the meeting again of somebody that I really didn't care much about back then and have not had any occasion to think about in the intervening years would justify. But instead of, oh, hey, fantastic, it's great to see you again. Why is this? It is because there's a little foretaste of something that we might hope for in the aftermath of our death, this foretaste of the resurrection. So even indifference, meeting somebody to whom we were indifferent after decades of separation, is a pleasant experience. Schopenhauer here, I think, is speaking to a sort of common psychological phenomenon. I don't think that he is suggesting anything about Christian revelation being true. He's simply saying this is the sort of pattern that we observe in ourselves, and here is an explanation for it. Just as parting is like death, coming back together again, even with somebody we didn't think that much of, is like something going like a resurrection beyond death. So those are the 18th through 23rd observations from psychological observations. The 24th is quite long, longer than all of these combined, and it deals with the different degrees of reality that Schopenhauer ascribes to different types of consciousness or selfhood. I think you'll find it very interesting, and we'll deal with that in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Hi. In the 24th psychological observation from studies in pessimism, Schopenhauer describes 4 different types of human being, which he argues have different levels of consciousness and consequently different levels of reality, of existence. I'll call these the worker, the merchant, the scholar, and the philosopher or poet. This passage invites an obvious comparison and connection to some of Nietzsche's thoughts about the order of rank between different human types and the will to power, so I invite you to think about that. This time I will read the passage all the way through and offer all of my commentary at the end. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. Intellects differ from one another in a very real and fundamental way. But no comparison can be well made by merely general observations. It is necessary to come close and to go into details, for the difference that exists cannot be seen from afar, and it is not easy to judge by outward appearances, as in the several cases of education, leisure, and occupation. But even judging by these alone, it must be admitted that many a man has a degree of existence at least 10 times as high as another. In other words, exists 10 times as much. I am not speaking here of savages, whose life is often only 1 degree above that of the apes in the woods. Consider, for instance, a porter in Naples or Venice. In the north of Europe, solicitude for the winter months makes people more thoughtful and therefore reflective. Look at the life he leads, from its beginning to its end. Driven by poverty, living on his physical strength, meeting the needs of every day, nay, of every hour, by hard work, great effort, constant tumult, want in all its forms, no care for the morrow, his only comfort, rest after exhaustion, continuous quarreling, not a moment free for reflection, such sensual delights as a mild climate and only just sufficient food will permit of, and then finally, as the metaphysical element, the crass superstition of his church. The whole forming a manner of life with only a low degree of consciousness, where a man hustles, or rather is hustled, through his existence. This restless and confused dream forms the life of how many millions? Such men think only just so much as is necessary to carry out their will for the moment. They never reflect upon their life as a connected whole, let alone then upon existence in general. To a certain extent they may be said to exist without really knowing it. The existence of the mobsman or the slave, who lives on in this unthinking way, stands very much nearer than ours to that of the brute, which is confined entirely to the present moment. But for that very reason, it also has less of pain in it than ours. Nay, since all pleasure is in its nature negative, that is to say, consists in freedom from some form of misery or need, the constant and rapid interchange between setting about something and getting it done, which is the permanent accompaniment of the work they do, and then again the augmented form which this takes when they go from work to rest and the satisfaction of their needs, all this gives them a constant source of enjoyment. And the fact that it is much commoner to see happy faces amongst the poor than amongst the rich is a sure proof that it is used to good advantage. Passing from this kind of man, consider next the sober, sensible merchant, who leads a life of speculation, thinks long over his plans and carries them out with great care, founds a house and provides for his wife, his children and descendants, takes his share, too, in the life of a community. It is obvious that a man like this has a much higher degree of consciousness than the former, and so his existence has a higher degree of reality. Then look at the man of learning who investigates, it may be, the history of the past. He will have reached the point at which a man becomes conscious of existence as a whole, sees beyond the period of his own life, beyond his own personal interests, thinking over the whole course of the world's history. Then finally, look at the poet or the philosopher, in whom reflection has reached such a height that instead of being drawn on to investigate any one particular phenomenon of existence, he stands in amazement before existence itself, this great sphinx, and makes it his problem. In him, consciousness has reached the degree of clearness at which it embraces the world itself. His intellect has completely abandoned its function as the servant of his will, and now holds the world before him, and the world calls upon him much more to examine and consider it than to play a part in it himself. If, then, the degree of consciousness is the degree of reality, such a man will be said to exist most of all, and there will be sense and significance in so describing him. Between the two extremes here sketched, and the intervening stages, everyone will be able to find the place at which he himself stands. So that's the end of Schopenhauer, of this passage of Schopenhauer. And we have an interesting meditation upon the nature of human consciousness, and he says this tenfold increase in reality by the philosopher or poet over the brutish type of worker. So let's just review what Schopenhauer has told us. There are millions of people, he thinks of the warm climate of the south of Italy, Naples and elsewhere, where a man might engage in this constant labor, just barely meeting the needs of life. He is brutish, he is unreflective, he lives in the present moment, more or less, like an animal, as we heard talked about before. He has less pleasure than higher types of man, but also less pain, and since pain is the primary thing in life, he seems to be making out rather better. In fact, the constant tumult of his life and the regular exchange of struggle and work for relaxation and the meeting of desire, we might say the sort of activity of his will and the satisfaction of his will frequently alternating between them, gives his life a certain kind of enjoyment and satisfaction. We move up next to this slightly higher kind of human being, the merchant, the respectable person, the person who makes plans and acts on plans, who has a thought for the future, but it's a kind of worldly future, right? This is the sort of temporality of the bourgeois middle class, right? Who wishes to be responsible, who makes plans, who is active in his community, who provides for his family, who thinks for his descendants, but is still, I think, confined by this kind of ideal of social respectability that we associate with the bourgeois. We move then to the man of learning, the scholar, perhaps the historian, who has begun to contemplate existence itself, who sees now beyond his own lifetime and beyond the utility of simply providing for his lifetime, or even by inheritance or life insurance providing for his descendants. He's now beginning to, at the early stages of thinking about the world as a whole. And he's achieved a certain kind of impersonal relation to the world as an object of his knowledge. And then finally, I think Schopenhauer indicates that it's the poet or the philosopher who completes and perfects this type of engagement with the real by achieving, he says, first a greater clarity, and we might say a greater comprehensiveness as well. He's able to think of existence itself, and this is the point at which intellect has slipped the leash that will normally holds it on. The intellect is no longer serving the will to achieve what the object strived for, but rather is contemplating the world as it is, taking in the overall drama of existence itself. And it's achieving here a certain kind of passivity, right? It no longer wants to do, it's no longer called by the universe to do things within it, but simply to contemplate it and to think about it, to know it. And this is the place where kind of the figure of the Eastern sage or holy man who has ascended to a higher level of consciousness really comes into play. So those are the four types of Schopenhauer, and I think we might be justly troubled by this assignment of a greater degree of reality to some humans rather than to others, especially this association of the common run of man, especially in the warmer climates where people can live simply with a minimal amount of work, with the brutes and the lower forms of people. I think the history of the 20th century should make us at least a little bit disquieted about this type of suggestion. And I can offer two things in mitigation of this sort of ill ease we might feel at Schopenhauer's analysis. We might say the kind of the metaphysics of different types of human consciousness. The first is that Schopenhauer has spoken before about the attitude of contempt that the superior person might feel for the inferior. But he's also noted this does not call forth hatred or violence on the part of the higher for the lower. In fact, rather the opposite. There's a certain kind of solicitude that awareness of one's own superiority inspires towards the lower orders, because the superior man really just wants to be left alone. And so he may nod and cooperate and smile and even be quite friendly with people for whom he has contempt. So this idea that contempt leads to hatred and to violence, I think, is a mistake. And I think recognizing that might humanize Schopenhauer's analysis of the greater reality of these higher types of persons. And secondly, I want to note that, especially with this final observation, that between these two extremes, everyone can find his current location. That invites us, I think, to think of Schopenhauer's categories here not merely as placing each of us in relation to our fellow man, right? Am I one of this class, or one of these higher classes that has more reality to it? He's also describing, I think, stages of our own internal psychological growth, I'd say spiritual progress in a Schopenhauerian sense. I've risen above the brutish level to the bourgeois level. Perhaps I've begun to break through to the scholar level with the ambition of eventually freeing my intellect more and more from my will. So if we think of this as a recipe for personal growth and a way of reminding us that here are the characteristics of the sort of bourgeois merchant stage of individual psychology, I have to be careful that I rise beyond that. I don't want to slide back into it. I want to comport myself and adjust my mind and my priorities and the way I live my life and conceive of myself in a way that is going to lead to a greater and greater detachment of my intellect from my will, rising more towards this kind of intellectual contemplation of the whole of existence. So even if I can't live that way all the time, or I'm currently at one state, I can situate myself here without coming to judgments about the moral worth or the political systems that should govern people at different levels of reality. That said, by mitigation, I might further add as a third point, I do recollect that C.S. Lewis used a similar metaphor here in The Great Divorce in talking about the progress of souls towards the heavenly afterlife as a matter of their acquiring a greater kind of density and solidity. People who first arrive at the purgatorial place are kind of ghostly and barely there, and as they move forward, as they make progress, they sort of fill in their outline and become denser. They become more solid as they go along. They acquire a greater degree of reality. So I'd say those three things in mitigation of any discomfort we might feel about hearing Schopenhauer describe to us in detail how certain types of human beings have a higher degree of consciousness, which makes them 10 times more real or gives them a higher degree of existence than other human beings. So that's all for this observation. We'll look at the 25th observation in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Hi. The next three psychological observations from Schopenhauer, numbers 25, 26, and 27 by my count, deal with training, the way in which training, especially from childhood, can control or vary human opinion and action. Schopenhauer also tells us a bit about imagination and its relation to the senses, and about the changeability of opinion. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. We know that man in general is superior to all other animals, and this is also the case in his capacity for being trained. Mohammedans are trained to pray with their faces turned towards Mecca 5 times a day, and they never fail to do it. Christians are trained to cross themselves on certain occasions, to bow, and so on. Indeed, it may be said that religion is the chef d'oeuvre of the art of training, because it trains people in the way they shall think, and, as is well known, you cannot begin the process too early. There is no absurdity so palpable but that it may be firmly planted in the human head if only you begin to inculcate it before the age of 5 by constantly repeating it with an air of great solemnity. For, as is the case of animals, so in that of men, training is successful only when you begin in early youth. Schopenhauer here, I think, is repeating an observation made by Plato and Aristotle about the force that youthful education has upon us. We remember Plato from Republic talking about the training of the young guardians in the ideal city. Aristotle near the beginning of Nicomachean Ethics emphasizing that a person will be a good student of ethics if he has been well brought up in his habits. So he already recognizes good and virtuous habits by training prior to rationally reflecting upon them. Schopenhauer here taking a bit of a different perspective, though, in saying that the trainability of human beings is far superior to that of animals, just as we are superior in the matter of intellect and of will and of self-consciousness. We are also superior in the matter of trainability. We are the most trainable of all the animals. Our nature, we might say, puts up the least resistance to attempts to shunt our minds into one particular path. And so there is no absurdity that you cannot make someone believe if you begin telling it to him repeatedly at the age of 5. This holds with behavior, religion then being the kind of masterpiece, the sort of sine qua non of behavioral and mental control. So Schopenhauer is going to go on in the rest of this observation to give us some examples and applications of this idea of training in different areas of culture. He continues. Noblemen and gentlemen are trained to hold nothing sacred but their word of honor, to maintain a zealous, rigid, and unshaken belief in the ridiculous code of chivalry, and if they are called upon to do so, to seal their belief by dying for it, and seriously to regard a king as a being of a higher order. Again, our expressions of politeness, the compliments we make, in particular, the respectful attentions we pay to ladies, are a matter of training, as also our esteem for good birth, rank, titles, and so on. Of the same character is the resentment we feel at any insult directed against us, And the measure of this resentment may be exactly determined by the nature of the insult. An Englishman, for instance, thinks it a deadly insult to be told that he is no gentleman, or still worse, that he is a liar. A Frenchman has the same feeling if you call him a coward, and a German if you say he is stupid. There are many persons who are trained to be strictly honorable in regard to one particular matter, while they have little honor to boast of in anything else. Many a man, for instance, will not steal your money, but he will lay hands on everything of yours that he can enjoy without having to pay for it. A man of business will often deceive you without the slightest scruple, but he will absolutely refuse to commit a theft. That's the end of this 25th observation. And I think Schopenhauer's added some applications in terms of manners, both in terms of compliments paid and insults received and reacted to. This differs with not just with national character, but with national training, right? It is because French parents train their children to be deeply offended at any suggestion of cowardice that they react just as they do. And the same thing holds with English and with German children and then later adults. And then there's this observation at the end of the fact that this can be heavily siloed or compartmentalized. A man might have a great deal of training and honor and virtue in one particular area. He will never knowingly cheat you in a matter of business and money, but he will exploit you in many other ways. In other words, this virtue doesn't export to neighboring areas of his personality. Why? Because it depends upon the specific training that he got when he was a child. If he apprenticed with a certain kind of teacher, he may have adopted a sort of rigid internal code of conduct just habitually, which he will never vary from. But there will be other areas which might seem to us to be related, to which he's not applied those lessons, not having received training in those specific areas. So let's go on to the next observation now. Imagination is strong in a man when that particular function of the brain which enables him to observe is roused to activity without any necessary excitement of the senses. Accordingly, we find that imagination is active just in proportion as our senses are not excited by external objects. A long period of solitude, whether in prison or in a sick room, quiet, twilight, and darkness, these are the things that promote its activity, and under their influence it comes into play of itself. On the other hand, when a great deal of material is presented to our faculties of observation, as happens on a journey or in the hurly-burly of the world, or again in broad daylight, the imagination is idle, and, even though call may be made upon it, refuses to become active, as though it understood that that was not its proper time. However, if the imagination is to yield any real product, it must have received a great deal of material from the external world. This is the only way in which its storehouse can be filled. The fantasy is nourished much in the same way as the body, which is least capable of any work and enjoys doing nothing just in the very moment when it receives its food which it has to digest. And yet it is to this very food that it owes the power which it afterwards puts forth at the right time. I like this comparison at the end of the imagination to the senses to experience as the body to the food that it consumes. So just as I am least active right after I've had a big meal. Why? Because my body is devoted to digesting the meal for the sake of having energy to use in activity later on. The imagination is least active when the senses and the experiences are overwhelming, when I have a lot going on, when I'm on a journey in new places, new things are happening, I'm taking in new things. At that point, I may even try to use my imagination to call up some images or do some creative work, and I may be unable to do so. The imagination seems to be active or idle in inverse proportion to the activity of my senses and my experience. And that this is just an observation about the way our psychology works. We collect experiences, and then in a quiet and idle moment, those experiences will be worked upon and perhaps generate some new creative product. This also suggests that the greatest artists, the greatest creators, think Shakespeare, for example, will be people of very wide experience, people who have learned and done a lot. You would not expect if Schopenhauer is right about this, you would not expect great creative products from a person who had had a very sheltered life or who moved about in a very narrow social circle. So the suggestion here is that the mind, the imagination feeds upon the experiences that we put into it. And so while the imagination requires solitude to work, we think of the writer who perhaps has to go off into the woods or to seek some solitary um, place in which to write. Um, the imagination is going to function best by drawing upon what has been fed into the mind through the experiences prior to that. So that's the 26th observation. Here's the 27th, which is quite short. Opinion is like a pendulum and obeys the same law. If it goes past the center of gravity on one side, it must go a like distance on the other. And it is only after a certain time that it finds the true point at which it can remain at rest. I was able to find the German text of this in my copy, and the word he's using for opinion here is die Meinung, which can mean both personal opinions and also popular opinion. So I think Schopenhauer is referring here both to my own opinions on a particular subject, on a particular topic, may swing back and forth until they find that kind of point of rest of gravity as I sort of zero in on the opinion that will then be stable as my sort of conviction, we might say, instead of opinion. And the same thing will happen, as is often observed, especially in political years, with public opinion. There'll be a swing to the left, followed by a swing back to the right, which will go past the center point, probably just about as far as the previous excess was. And there's this kind of law of the pendulum to opinion, both in the public opinion of the crowd and the masses, and in the opinions of a single individual. So this seems to be, according to Schopenhauer, the way in which our opinions kind of exceed our rational control. We can't make ourselves believe things, but there is a kind of momentum that works there that gradually decreases, and we sort of zoom in and focus in upon the kind of final resting point at which opinion becomes fixed and remains at rest. So those are the 25th through 27th observations in the psychological observations section of Schopenhauer's Studies in Pessimism, translated by T. Bailey Saunders. The next group of observations are about memory, and we'll look at those in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. The next 6 psychological observations, numbers 28 through 33, all deal with memory. Among the topics that Schopenhauer touches on here are why it is that the past always seems better than the present when we compare our memories to our current experiences. He has a speculative explanation for that. How it is that sometimes we form vivid and long-lasting memories, seemingly at random, even about trivial events in our lives. And then finally, the last observation about the effect that intoxication can have on our memory. So here's the first observation. By a process of contradiction, distance in space makes things look small, and therefore free from defect. This is why a landscape looks so much better in a contracting mirror or in a camera obscura than it is in reality. The same effect is produced by distance in time. The scenes and events of long ago, and the persons who took part in them, wear a charming aspect to the eye of memory, which sees only the outlines and takes no note of disagreeable details. The present enjoys no such advantage, and so it always seems defective. And again, as regards space, small objects close to us look big, and if they are very close, we may be able to see nothing else. But when we go a little way off, they become minute and invisible. It is the same again as regards time. The little incidents and accidents of every day fill us with emotion, anxiety, annoyance, passion, as long as they are close to us. When they appear so big, so important, so serious, but as soon as they are borne down the restless stream of time, they lose what significance they had. We think no more of them, and soon forget them altogether. They were only big because they were near. This first observation, I think, gives us some interesting food for thought, of course, about the way in which, just like objects at a distance can only be seen in outline, but without any sort of detail which might be disagreeable or upsetting, the things that we remember the broad outlines of the past. We remember that we took a trip, not the particular pains and discomforts that we experienced on the trip. We remember the good things and not the bad things, but more generally, we remember the large outlines and not the specific details. And since we might say those particular details are likely to be the things that caused us the most discomfort and pain at the time, those are the things that will sort of get washed out as it recedes in time. So some of the imagery here, some of the writing borne down the restless stream of time, is quite nice. I don't know how much of that is Saunders and how much of that is Schopenhauer, but it's a nice expression and a nice way of putting things. They were big only because they were near, only because they occupied our mind. And I think the second point Schopenhauer is drawing upon here is that it is the events of the present that activate our will most strongly and most vividly. It is the things I'm going through right now, or the things in my immediate future, my immediate past, which are the most annoying, most upsetting, most significant to me. Why? Because they are right here. They have this kind of lensing effect of being in the present. Schopenhauer is speaking of that elsewhere in other works we've talked about. It is just because they are here that they seem so significant, but in themselves, are they? Not really. And as soon as they are a month, a year, 10 years distant, they'll seem much less so. They'll appear to us more, we might say, in their natural aspect, as being relatively insignificant events in the life of a being like myself. I recollect here, thinking about this topic, a saying that my old college roommate used to have when we were going through an unpleasant experience. He would say, "This will be funny in the past tense." As once we're able to speak of this as being past, it'll be hilarious. We'll laugh about it. Right now, while we're undergoing it, we're having to deal with whatever this problem is with our roommate, our friend, some teacher, or uh, authority figure. Right now, it's miserable. It sucks. But when you're able to tell a story about it 6 months from now, a year from now, when the emotions and the elements of will that invest it with significance are no longer there, then it'll be an object of mirth, something that we can laugh about. So I think of that in relation to this observation of Schopenhauer's. Here's the next one. Joy and sorrow are not ideas of the mind, but affections of the will, and so they do not lie in the domain of memory. We cannot recall our joys and sorrows, by which I mean that we cannot renew them. We can recall only the ideas that accompanied them, and in particular the things that we were led to say. And these form a gauge of our feelings at the time. Hence, our memory of joys and sorrows is always imperfect, and they become a matter of indifference to us as soon as they are over. This explains the vanity of the attempt, which we sometimes make, to revive the pleasures and the pains of the past. Pleasure and pain are essentially an affair of the will, and the will as such is not possessed of memory, which is a function of the intellect. And this, in its turn, gives out and takes in nothing but thoughts and ideas, which are not here in question. It is a curious fact that in bad days we can very vividly recall the good time that is now no more, but that in good days we have only a very cold and imperfect memory of the bad. Schopenhauer here is relating memory and will, and noting that what we recall are only ideas, things in the intellect, the joys and sorrows, the emotions I felt at an event in the past. those are parts of the will and not directly tied to the memory. So if I try to recover my memory of the joy of my wedding, what I will be doing is trying to recall the ideas associated with it, and then I think trying to use those to spur my present will into a mood of joy again, or of sorrow, or whatever emotion I'm trying to remember. I can't remember the emotion directly. I can remember what I did and said, and I can try to feel again in the will what these intellectual flavored memories can bring to mind in me, but I can't actually reproduce the emotion. I think this is an experiment for any of the viewers to try. Can I generate an emotion in myself using a memory? And when I do so, is it simply the memory, the idea, or the recollection of what I've said or done at the time that is stimulating my current will to the state of the emotion that I'm thinking of, whether it's fear or joy or sorrow or the like? About this final observation here about that on bad days I can more vividly recall the good times past. We might say that magnifies my misery. But on good days I have only a very cold and imperfect memory of the bad. I wonder if that is true for everyone. Thinking now, I suspect it's probably true for myself. When I am feeling bad, I think back to my previous times, and they seem quite vivid and warm uh, in in memory in comparison to what I'm feeling now. I don't know if the same is true. I think about at a time of joy, do I experience the only a very cold and imperfect memory of the bad times previously? Perhaps people have experienced they can enlighten me with in the comments section below. In the meantime, let's move on to the next observation. We have a much better memory of actual objects or pictures than for mere ideas. Hence, a good imagination makes it easier to learn languages, for by its aid the new word is at once united with the actual object to which it refers, whereas if there is no imagination, it is simply put on parallel with the equivalent word in the mother tongue. Mnemonics should not only mean the art of keeping something indirectly in memory by the use of some direct pun or witticism. It should rather be applied to a systematic theory of memory, and explain its several attributes by reference both to its real nature and to the relation in which these attributes stand to one another. I take this short observation to be making 2 points. One, about the fact that our imagination focuses upon the concrete, and this is an aid in learning languages. If you're ever composing mnemonics or trying to go through the memory palace technique, I have a video on that from way back. The more creative and imaginative you can be in generating your mnemonic pictures, the more absurd they are, the more easily memorable they are. A person with a feeble or no imagination simply has to put the word in the foreign language next to the word in the known language, and we might say kind of brute force it, just memorize. This means this, this means this, this means this. Why? Because they're not able to imaginatively connect the word in the language to some picture or direct connection to the object that the word signifies. They're simply linking symbols together in multiple languages. And then this call, I don't know if this is a special interest of Schopenhauer's, this call for mnemonics to be not just a reference to these absurd pictures that we make up to assist us in remembering things, including languages and translations, but a systematic science of memory, an examination of memory more deeply than obviously is being done here in these short aphoristic observations, but a science of the aspects of memory, their interrelation, and the way in which they function in human life and in the human intellect. I don't know if anybody has done that in the Schopenhauerian sense, but it seems he's just simply calling for a more direct attention to the faculty of memory by psychologists. Next observation. There are moments in life when our senses obtain a higher and rarer degree of clearness, apart from any particular occasion for it in the nature of our surroundings, and explicable rather on physiological grounds alone, as the result of some enhanced state of susceptibility working from within outwards. Such moments remain indelibly impressed upon the memory, and preserve themselves in their individuality entire. We can assign no reason for it, nor explain why this, among so many thousand moments like it, should be specially remembered. It seems as much a matter of chance as when single specimens of a whole race of animals now extinct are discovered in the layers of a rock, or when, on opening a book, we light upon an insect accidentally crushed within the leaves. Memories of this kind are always sweet and pleasant. Schopenhauer here is commenting upon something that I think we've all experienced. I know that I have. The impression of an especially vivid memory at one moment. In fact, you may even be aware of it happening at the moment it's happening. You would say to yourself, I'm going to remember this moment for the rest of my life. Not perhaps because it's especially significant, the moment of a wedding or of some special occasion or some terrible disaster, but simply because it is impressed upon me. Why? Well, Schopenhauer says it seems a large element of chance, but also an element, a physiological element, an element of susceptibility. And here I can tell a story from my own past of a memory like this for me. There was a time, I think maybe about 12 years ago, when I was walking down to the park with my wife and our kids, and I saw the four kids running ahead of us, each one of them running in their own particular style. The toddler with a kind of, toddler um, run stumble, the long-legged kid running out front, kind of goofy, swinging his arms and legs. And I said to myself, as I'm walking beside my wife, I thought to myself, I'm going to remember this moment for the rest of my life. I was happy. I was overjoyed. It was a pleasant sunny day, but there was nothing about that particular event that should mark it out for filing in the sort of permanent, vivid memories section of my mind. And yet, here it is 12 years ago that I remember it. Schopenhauer's explanation is that there's something physiological going on. There was something about me that made me especially susceptible and impressible to memories, perhaps especially, we might say, memories of my family, my children, and awareness of time going by, of them growing up, of my own mortality and limitations, perhaps. But for some reason, my mind, my brain makes me especially vulnerable to and susceptible to the formation of those sorts of memories. And from my experience, he certainly is correct that such memories are always very sweet and pleasant. In the next observation, Schopenhauer goes on. It occasionally happens that, for no particular reason, long forgotten scenes suddenly start up in the memory. This may, in many cases, be due to the action of some hardly perceptible odor, which accompanied those scenes, and now recurs exactly the same as before. For it is well known that the sense of smell is specially effective in awakening memories, and that, in general, it does not require much to rouse a train of ideas. And I may say, in passing, that the sense of sight is connected with understanding, the sense of hearing with the reason, and, as we see in the present case, the sense of smell with memory. Touch and taste are more material and dependent upon contact. They have no ideal side. I think Schopenhauer is correct here about the memory power of odors. I think that's been somewhat well established by psychology in our own time, that for whatever reason, despite the faintness of the power of that sense in humans, the association with memories and the ability to awaken memories that are deeply hidden in my past, perhaps after 70 or 80 years, is quite vivid and quite powerful. It seems just to be a physiological, natural fact about us and our brains and our minds and how we work. This later observation about sight and hearing, I don't know that I quite follow. We might have to look deeper into Schopenhauer's metaphysical works, his more systematic works, to fully understand the claim he's making here about sight and understanding, about hearing and reason. The best I can think about reason is that since reason is how we hear voices, which would bear to us words, which would be symbols of meanings, perhaps there's a way in which the intellect is activated by hearing and engagement with ideas. Smell and memory, I agree with. Taste and touch, interestingly here, Schopenhauer says, have no ideal side because they depend upon direct physical contact with the object, because they are connected to the skin or the taste buds. They are more material And so we're not going to see them activate the higher faculties of us. They're much more, I might say, part of our animal embodied nature than the other three senses. Going on to the final observation of this video now. It must also be reckoned among the peculiar attributes of memory that a slight state of intoxication often so greatly enhances the recollection of past times and scenes that all the circumstances connected with them come back much more clearly than would be possible in a state of sobriety. But that, on the other hand, the recollection of what one said or did while the intoxication lasted is more than usually imperfect. Nay, that if one has been absolutely tipsy, it is gone altogether. We may say then that whilst intoxication enhances the memory for what is past, it allows it to remember little of the present. In that passage, I especially like the tasteful expression, if when one has been absolutely tipsy. I appreciate T. Bailey Saunders for that. The observation here is that uh, intoxication with alcohol may vivify memories from the past. I might remember things from 20 or 30 years ago under the influence. I might see them clearly again. But at the same time, my experience for remembering what I am actually doing right now at this moment seems to suffer in comparison. This just by way of observation of the effect of alcohol upon the memory. It brings the past closer to us, and it seems to suppress our formation of memories about the present. So it has this weird sort of enhancing while also dulling the memory effect. So an interesting observation about the way that we are, the way that our memories function, and that closes out the sixth of these observations about the nature of memory. We will look at the final set of psychological observations from studies in pessimism in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Hi. The final three psychological observations from studies in pessimism deal with activity and boredom, and the last one is a long observation about gesticulation, the use of gesture in communication. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. Men need some kind of external activity because they are inactive within. Contrarily, if they are active within, they do not care to be dragged out of themselves. It disturbs and impedes their thoughts in a way that is often most ruinous to them. In this first observation, I think Schopenhauer is giving us a sort of short aphoristic expression of this tension between people who have an inner life, intellectuals, I think, like himself, and people who are so very active in the affairs of the world, who are always running around achieving things, working hard out in the world, precisely because there is no inner activity. So it seems that either we can have the inner activity, in which case being dragged out into the world disturbs us, or if we are relatively empty inside, we seek to sort of lose and divert ourselves in the activity of the exterior world. Schopenhauer goes on in the next observation. I am not surprised that some people are bored when they find themselves alone, for they cannot laugh if they are quite by themselves. The very idea of it seems folly to them. Are we then to look upon laughter as merely a signal for others, a mere sign, like a word? What makes it impossible for people to laugh when they are alone is nothing but want of imagination, dullness of mind generally. And here he quotes a line of Greek. As Theophrastus has it, the lower animals never laugh, either alone or in company. Myson, the misanthropist, was once surprised by one of these people as he was laughing to himself. Why do you laugh? He asked. There is no one with you. That is just why I am laughing, said Myson. This observation seems to me to be of a piece with the previous one, that there is something perhaps Nietzschean here in the capacity to laugh within oneself, to be able to have this certain kind of inner life which can generate laughter, not as a signal to other people, but completely outside of their presence. And so, my son, the misanthropist, as an example. But for some people, even the prospect of laughing when one is alone is unthinkable to them. And perhaps I can look up the translation of that Greek phrase and put it on the screen when I edit this video. I don't have it ready to hand right now. So laughter, again, as with Nietzsche, maybe a sign of a certain kind of superior spirit. Here's the final observation about gesticulation. Natural gesticulation, such as commonly accompanies any lively talk, is a language of its own, more widespread even than the language of words. So far, I mean, as it is independent of words, and alike in all nations. It is true that nations make use of it in proportion as they are vivacious, and that in particular cases, amongst the Italians for instance, it is supplemented by peculiar gestures which are merely conventional, and therefore possessed of nothing more than a local value. In the universal use made of it, gesticulation has some analogy with logic and grammar, in that it has to do with the form rather than with the matter of conversation. But on the other hand, it is distinguishable from them by the fact that it has more of a moral than of an intellectual bearing. In other words, it reflects the movements of the will. As an accompaniment of conversation, it is like the bass of a melody. And if, as in music, it keeps true to the progress of the treble, it serves to heighten the effect. In a conversation, the gesture depends upon the form in which the subject matter is conveyed, and it is interesting to observe that, whatever the subject matter may be, with the recurrence of the form, the very same gesture is repeated. So if I happen to see, from my window say, two persons carrying on a lively conversation, without my being able to catch a word, I can nevertheless understand the general nature of it perfectly well. I mean, the kind of thing that is being said, and the form it takes. There is no mistake about it. The speaker is arguing about something, advancing his reasons, then limiting their application, then driving them home and drawing the conclusion in triumph. Or he is recounting his experiences, proving perhaps beyond a shadow of a doubt how much he has been injured, but bringing the clearest and most damning evidence to show that his opponents were foolish and obstinate people who would not be convinced. Or else he is telling of the splendid plan he laid, and how he carried it to a successful issue. Or perhaps failed because the luck was against him. Or it may be he is saying that he was completely at a loss to know what to do, or that he was quick in seeing some traps set for him, and that by insisting on his rights or by applying a little force, he succeeded in frustrating and punishing his enemies, and so on in hundreds of cases of a similar kind. Strictly speaking, however, what I get from gesticulation alone is an abstract notion of the essential drift of what is being said, and that too, whether I judge it from a moral or an intellectual point of view. It is the quintessence, the true substance of the conversation, and this remains identical no matter what may have given rise to the conversation, or what it may be about, the relation between the two being that of a general idea or class name to the individuals which it covers. I think I'll pause here to offer some commentary before we go on to the rest of this observation. Some great observations here from Schopenhauer about the nature of gesture as a kind of universal language. It has a kind of local intensity, especially among the Italians. I recollect once a professor's wife telling me about a trip they took to Italy. This might have been back in the 1980s, where they were observing the kind of intensity of some of these gestures among Southern Italians. And one was especially terrifying. She demonstrated it for me, but I won't show it to you. A man sort of looked at her fiercely and bit the side of his hand, right, just like this. You know, that was terrifying. But there are all sorts of gestures of local interest that are merely conventional, but beyond that, there is this kind of universal expressiveness of the body that maybe is used more by the more vivacious nations of the earth, the Italians, perhaps Mediterraneans generally, but that has a kind of universal understanding. So this is great story, these examples Schopenhauer can imagine. Seeing from my window, I can tell what kind of conversation it is a way in which gesture alone visually will give me the genus of the conversation that is being had without my having to understand the particular content. I can tell when somebody is trying to explain or justify himself, when somebody is angry, when somebody is defensive, when somebody is trying to prove a point or to tell a story. And so these are obviously, as we'll see in just a moment, going to be important for actors and for people who are trying to communicate on the stage. So I think overall, we've got a sort of set of observations here about the character of the expressive use of the body. So Schopenhauer now then goes on. As I have said, the most interesting and amusing part of the matter is the complete identity and solidarity of the gestures used to denote the same set of circumstances, even though by people of very different temperament, so that the gestures become exactly like the words of a language, alike for everyone, and subject only to such small modifications as depend upon variety of accent and education. And yet there can be no doubt but that these standing gestures, which everyone uses, are the result of no convention or collusion. They are original and innate, a true language of nature, consolidated, it may be, by imitation and the influence of custom. It is well known that it is part of an actor's duty to make a careful study of gesture, and the same thing is true, to a somewhat smaller degree, of a public speaker. The study must consist chiefly in watching others and imitating their movements, for there are no abstract rules fairly applicable to the matter, with the exception of some very general principles, such as, to take an example, that the gesture must not follow the word, but rather come immediately before it, by way of announcing its approach and attracting the hearer's attention. Englishmen entertain a peculiar contempt for gesticulation, and look upon it as something vulgar and undignified. This seems to me a silly prejudice on their part, and the outcome of their general prudery. For here we have a language which nature has given to everyone, and which everyone understands, and to do away with and forbid it for no better reason than it is opposed to that much lauded thing, gentlemanly feeling, is a very questionable proceeding. That's the conclusion of the final observation from the psychological observations section of Studies in Pessimism. And I think we have another dig here at the English, of course, at the end, sort of the anti-Italians in matters of gesture, and a reminder that the duty of the actor is to observe the natural use of these gestures so that he can communicate his own craft through them on the stage. And there's also the suggestion that gestures do have this natural universal character. I wonder if this is in fact the case. I don't know how one would make a test of this, but Schopenhauer seems to be quite confident that the same gestures will be used and will be recognizable to people of all nations at all places and times. And maybe with the exception of the Italian biting the side of his hand, I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I wonder if, the sort of shrug of the shoulders or the hands outstretched would always be taken everywhere by everyone to mean doubt or uncertainty. But perhaps I'm leaving out facial expression as well. So those are some more of Schopenhauer's psychological observations. The next essay in Studies in Pessimism, which we'll turn to in the next video, is on education. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.